From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I'm Carla Gonzalez, and this is From the South. The United States Treasury Department has announced more sanctions against Venezuela. They target 6 senior officers in the Bolivarian armed forces and the police. They include the head of the National Guard and commanders in charge of military and police forces on Venezuela's borders with Brazil and Colombia. The U.S. claims these units used force against civilians last weekend, but video evidence showed opposition activists throwing Molotov cocktails at them. The Venezuelan ambassador to the UN has said that the United States is preparing a Contra-style war against his country. Samuel Moncada said they are beginning to train paramilitaries and supposed army deserters to launch attacks inside Venezuela, just as they did in Nicaragua in the 1980s.
That they are arming what so-called Venezuelan Liberation Army to penetrate into Venezuelan territory with supposedly deserters. They are saying that right now there are thousands of Venezuelan deserters, and it's absolutely not true. They are inflating those figures because they are fabricating their own Contra army, exactly the same like they did in Nicaragua during the 80s. This is a very serious and grave denunciation.
And Moncada was speaking after the United Nations Security Council rejected a draft resolution on Venezuela presented by the United States. Russia and China both vetoed the resolution, which called for immediate presidential elections in Venezuela and unrestricted access for so-called aid. South Africa also voted against. And the Security Council also rejected a resolution from Russia calling for a peaceful political solution to the situation in Venezuela. The Russian draft backed the Montevideo mechanism to promote dialogue between the government and the opposition. So what exactly was the Contra war in Nicaragua in the 1980s? To talk about this, we are joined live from Pittsburgh by Dan Kovalik. He's a professor of international human rights and author of a new book, The Plot to Control the World, about how the U.S. has subverted elections around the world. Thank you, Dan, for joining us.
Thank you.
So can you please explain to our viewers who might not know this, what the Contra war against the Sandinista revolution was?
Yes, it was a war that was organized and supported by the United States. After the Sandinistas overturned the U.S.-backed dictator in Nicaragua, Anastasio Somoza, in 1979, the U.S. attempted to restore the dictatorship by organizing Somoza's National Guardsmen into the Contras, which were essentially a terrorist organization that never gained any ground in Nicaragua. But what they did is attack civilian infrastructure like hospitals, clinics, electric grids. They would murder doctors, teachers. They would go into homes and rape entire families, kidnap people, kill them. In fact, they were so bad that Congress, the U.S. Congress, cut off aid to the Contras on 2 different occasions. But meanwhile, as we know, Ronald Reagan continued to fund them illegally through the Iran-Contra scandal. Ultimately, it should be noted, and I teach international law, and the first case that I give my students is Nicaragua versus the United States. The International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court, ultimately ruled against the United States in finding that its support for the Contras was illegal. And, of course, the U.S. ignored that. That decision came out in 1986. All told, 30,000 people in Nicaragua died due to the Contra War. This is a huge number of people because at the time of the time Somoza was overthrown, Nicaragua didn't even have 3 million people. So 30,000 people is astronomical. And if this is what the U.S. has planned for Venezuela, we must be very concerned.
And exactly that was my next question. Moncada says that the U.S. is planning to do the same in Venezuela, but how would that relate? Because it's 2 different times of the history.
Well, it is different times of history. And again, I think Moncada is right that unlike the National Guardsmen that the U.S. was able to assemble to attack Nicaragua, the U.S. probably doesn't have many deserters from the Venezuelan military to use. But remember, the U.S. does have military forces in Colombia, and the U.S. has paramilitary forces in Colombia. The paramilitaries, otherwise known as death squads, were created by the United States. They continue to exist. They continue to carry out assassinations within Colombia. And it would not be difficult for the U.S. to use those paramilitaries in some type of Contra effort against Venezuela. Now, what it would look like is very similar to the Contra War in Nicaragua. There's no way these paramilitaries could gain any ground or have any significant success against the Venezuelan military. But they could wreak a lot of havoc, they could kill a lot of people, and they could undermine the economy even further than the U.S. has undermined it by sanctions. So it's very dangerous. And again, unfortunately, in Colombia, the U.S. does have these paramilitary forces that can be used for these purposes and frankly have been used over the years against Venezuela in very low intensity operations.
And should Venezuela be worried about the fact that Elliot Abrams, one of the most involved in this crisis, the Iran-Contra scandal, is now in charge of all the things Venezuela for the Trump administration?
I think they should be. I think we all should be. As you note, Elliot Abrams was one of the key figures for Ronald Reagan who helped subvert U.S. law by funding the Contras, by illegal arms sales to Iran, and also through cocaine sales that were used to fund the Contras. At the same time, we have to remember that Mr. Abrams was also a key figure behind the war in El Salvador and behind such massacres as the El Mozote massacre, which claimed the lives of 800 Salvadorans. This is a bad guy. The fact that he is in charge of Venezuelan policy should really give everyone pause.
Thank you very much, Dan, for your time.
Thank you.
We were speaking to Dan Kovalik, a professor of international human rights, on what's probably going to happen in Venezuela, according to analysts like him. Now let's move to other news. We have also in the Caribbean region, the leaders will meet next week with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in Washington to discuss the situation in Venezuela. At the CARICOM summit in St. Kitts and Nevis this week, leaders maintained their policy of non-interference and non-intervention. Trinidad and Tobago's Prime Minister Keith Rowley is one of the delegation that will meet with Pompeo. He says his country is standing firmly behind its closest neighbor. He also described the United States' position on Venezuela as belligerent.
Grenada, we don't have a separate position. What we do have is a closeness, and we make no apologies, Trinidad and Tobago, for being on good terms with our neighbors, of which Venezuela is our closest neighbor. Venezuela is closer to Trinidad than is Scarborough, and we understand what that means. So we are not going to be encouraged onto anybody's bandwagon to our own detriment. And therefore, if there is to be any kind of intervention into the business of Venezuela, it ought to be through an agency which the world's countries have put in place for such circumstance. It is those who are preparing to disregard that is putting us at risk.
Venezuela has announced it will move the office of the state-owned oil company PDVSA from Lisbon to Moscow. The decision was announced by Venezuela's Vice President Delcy Rodriguez after a meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Moscow. Rodriguez said Europe no longer provides the necessary guarantees to protect her country's assets. Venezuela is also set to sign new trade deals with Russia that will focus on energy, agriculture and health.
Maduro has ordered that the offices of state-owned oil company PDVSA in Europe located in Lisbon be moved to Moscow. This is a way of strengthening our cooperation ties.
Russia will continue to assist the Venezuelan authorities in resolving social and economic problems, including through the provision of legitimate humanitarian aid. In general, we believe that the best way to help Venezuelans is to develop practical, pragmatic, and mutually beneficial interactions.
Pakistan has released the captured Indian Air Force pilot at the Wagah-Atari border crossing. Prime Minister Imran Khan said this was a gesture of peace aimed at easing tensions with its neighbor. Indian citizens and the media gathered at the border to welcome the downed pilot, who they consider a national hero. The conflict has been escalating after a suicide bomb attack killed at least 40 Indian soldiers in disputed Kashmir on February 14. Later, both countries claimed they shut down each other's planes, which ended in the capture of the pilot. At least 29 people have died after a car bomb exploded in a hotel in the Somali capital, Mogadishu. The death toll is likely to rise as a gun battle between soldiers and Al-Shabaab Islamist fighters continue to rage in a nearby building. According to the police, at least 80 people were injured in the attack. The location has been targeted by the Al-Shabaab group multiple times in the past, as it's favored by government officials. Let's hear from our correspondent Matuba Matlaji with the latest developments on this story.
Authorities in Somalia's capital, Mogadishu, say the death toll from a gun battle between Al-Shabaab fighters and Somali soldiers will most likely rise. What we know now is that as many as 29 people have been killed from the gunfire that started on Thursday night and continuing into early hours of Friday morning. Militant group Al-Shabaab is said to have occupied a building after detonating another, which has resulted in many injuries. And we are hearing that hospitals in that city are battling to cope with the number of casualties from this latest attack by Al-Shabaab. The Somali army is yet to confirm if it has control of the situation and whether they've neutralized or will be able to neutralize Al-Shabaab fighters who have often breached security in Mogadishu and killing innocent people. The insurgency in that country has driven thousands and thousands of people out of the country. There's a large Somali community here in South Africa, and that is a result of the unrest and the tensions that continue in that country between the Somali soldiers and the Al-Shabaab militant fighters. And this latest attack will most likely see more Somali people flee their own countries. Back to you, studio.
That was Matuba Matlaji, our correspondent. And with that, we'll take a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back. An 11-year-old Argentinian girl who was denied an abortion received a C-section this week, sparking a new debate about the country's strict abortion laws. The girl was raped by her grandmother's 65-year-old partner and had requested an abortion. Confusion over the girl's legal guardianship caused a delay until her 23rd week of pregnancy. At that point, some doctors refused to carry out the procedure. And last August, the Senate rejected a bill to legalize abortion in the first 14 weeks of pregnancy. The Amazon Defense Coalition in Ecuador has demanded that the government make oil company Chevron Texaco pay for the environmental damages caused after years of operations. Our correspondent in Quito, Denise Herrera, has the details.
Rafael Pandam is part of the indigenous movement since 1987. He has fought for the defense of the ancestral territories his entire lifetime. Rafael is one of the indigenous leaders who has battled alongside with the people affected by Chevron. He ensures that the population in the contaminated zones continues suffering the fatal consequences that the multinational left on their land.
We are not safe. There are many people getting sick with cancer and also with other diseases. Some indigenous leaders couldn't be present here with us. We want to say that we have an irresponsible state.
The Minister of Energy, Carlos Pérez, announced that the government will resolve the environmental damages of all the sites contaminated by Chevron Texaco in the Ecuadorian Amazon, announcement that has raised concerns among the people affected by Chevron.
It's an unfair issue to us. We can't understand that the state, who is not part of this case, will replace Chevron. For us, the solution should be a comprehensive work to protect life, health, and water, and to repair damages. The state must help the people affected.
Es decir, la vida humana, salud, agua y la reparación de todos daños.
The legal team of the Amazon Defense Coalition also expressed their concerns.
Es muy importante que tengan en cuenta.
It's very important to say that Petroecuador hasn't committed to put a solution. They don't even care about human life, which is the main matter here. We can say it crystal clear now that the government, which is negotiating with the International Monetary Fund, did nothing for the communities. Indigenous people have given his life and died for this. In technical aspects, why Petroecuador agreed for $1 billion? And now we'll try to solve what happened in the Amazon with the money of Ecuadorian citizens.
Son aspectos técnicos.
Experts on human rights highlight that this announcement violates Article 26 of the American Convention on Human Rights that established that economic, social, and cultural rights should have progressive development.
International law said that whoever contaminates a place has to pay. If the one that contaminates doesn't assume its responsibility, then citizens have to cover it. It's a serious problem because this cost will be assumed for citizens and will be covered with cuts in public and social programs.
The Amazon Defense Coalition ensure that they will continue with their struggle in different international courts to ensure that their rights will be respected. Denise Herrera, Telesur, Ecuador.
Human rights activists and social movements are denouncing increasing threats against environmental activists in Honduras. This comes after 2 indigenous leaders from the Tolupanes community were killed while defending their territory against a mining company. Other 12 activists have been detained, accused of provoking damages in another mining project.
In the community where I live, there is a Chilean company that wants to enter. We are resisting because the resources are ours. The water belongs to us, and the state is the violator of the rights. As Hondurans, the resources belong to us. They should rather reward people who defend the water and the forest.
And now environmental organizations are calling for a national protest to reject the criminalization of land defenders.
Outside the court of Tegucigalpa, family members of 12 environmental activists accompanied their loved ones, who are on trial for opposing the building of a mine on their lands.
They are accused of very bad crimes, because their only crime was defending our water source.
Besides criminalizing the activists from Guapinol, just a few days ago, 2 indigenous leaders were murdered in the north of the country, where opposition to mining is also prevalent.
We can see that the criminals are immune from persecution in our country, especially when it's our criminal government. They order the killings of our friends, they repress our movements.
Environmental organizations are often taken aback by the killings and criminalization of activists. They have denounced a national emergency, in particular near regions where mining is taking place.
We want to support our friends. They are fighting an injustice. They are being criminalized for simply defending their water source.
My brother is Juan Antonio Lopez, one of those accused by the Los Pinares mining company, owned by the Facus family.
Social leaders are calling for national demonstrations to condemn the country's justice system. They say there have been no investigations into the killings and that environmental activists are usually persecuted. Activists want previous agreements to be respected, especially in indigenous areas.
Repression, criminalization, and persecution by international companies are out of control. The Honduran government is in their pockets. They are the ones calling the shots.
In less than 10 years, 140 environmental activists were killed in Honduras, and over 5,000 have been criminalized by state agencies.
Liat, once the Caribbean's leading inter-islands airline, is now in serious financial difficulties and needs an emergency cash injection of $5 million to stay afloat. The airline only has enough cash to operate for just over a week and is now facing a possible shutdown if CARICOM does not intervene. Part of the airline's problems is that it has been flying unprofitable routes. Liat will now explore the possibility of economic cooperation with Trinidad and Tobago's state-owned Caribbean Airlines.
The heads of government were informed that Liat is in serious financial difficulty, needing, within a matter of a fortnight, an injection of minimum $5 million US in order to keep flying. Now, if Liat ceases to fly, I need not tell you the economic and other impact that that would have on the region. I have agreed to allow them to talk with CAL to see whether there is any economic benefit or possibilities for cooperation between CAL and Liat from that standpoint, purely from a business operations.
In Ecuador's Galapagos Islands, 155 young giant turtles bred in captivity have been released into the wild. The animals are part of an ecological program to repopulate the island of Santa Fe. According to the director of the Galapagos National Park, all the young turtles have a microchip that will follow their growth. We have more stories coming up. We'll be back.
An occasion to enjoy the cultural diversity that defines our South American essence. Come along to find out the story behind these personalities, traditions, and artistic expressions that unite us as a whole. Real Lives, Friday, only on Telesur.
Welcome back. The United Nations envoy to Yemen has left after attempting to convince Houthi leaders to withdraw from Hodeidah ports. UN envoy Martin Griffiths met with Houthi leaders in the capital Sana'a to discuss the withdrawal of forces, as it was agreed at the Stockholm peace dialogues. But lack of mutual trust and disputes between the government and the Houthis have delayed the withdrawal once again. This was Griffiths' third trip to Sana'a in 2 weeks, in a bid to open access for aid delivery to the Yemeni people. Thousands of Algerians have taken to the streets to protest against President Abdelaziz Bouteflika and his bid for a fifth term in power. This comes a day after the police briefly detained several journalists trying to cover the rarely seen anti-government demonstrations, which started a week ago. Bouteflika has been in power since 1991. The Department of Justice in the Philippines is to indict a French drug maker company and local health officials over deaths linked to a dengue vaccine. The Justice Department recommended charges for multiple counts of reckless imprudence resulting in homicide. It says over 10 deaths are linked to irregularities in implementing a dengue immunization program. There are nearly 200,000 dengue cases every year in the islands. North Korea has denied the claims by U.S. President Donald Trump that Kim Jong-un demanded all sanctions to be lifted during their summit in Vietnam. North Korea's foreign minister said Kim only asked for a partial sanction relief in exchange for dismantling their main nuclear facility. The foreign minister said they also offered to permanently halt nuclear and long-range rocket testing. Meanwhile, South Korean President Moon Jae-in has assured that his country will cooperate with the United States and North Korea to help facilitate the stranded talks. This in order to reach an agreement on denuclearization.
I believe that this is part of the process that will lead to a further agreement. Now, our role has become more important. The South Korean government will closely communicate and cooperate with the United States and North Korea so as to help their talks reach a complete settlement by any means.
With that, we reach the end of this news brief, but you can find these and many other stories by going to our website, telesurenglish.net. For our viewers in Africa, you can find us on Starsat channel 461 in South Africa and 539 in Nigeria. And you can join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Carla Gonzalez. Thank you for watching.